Professor Aidan Byrne over there is the CEO of the Australian Research Council. He has had a long and illustrious career in academia and research, and is a nuclear physicist, I believe, as well as obviously being in charge of one of, well, the most important grant funding mechanisms in Australia. Also very, very important, obviously, is the NHMRC, and to my left also is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Health and Medical Research Council. Now, Anne also has had a range of experience, including leading one or two cooperative research centres, and has been on the board of many institutes, as well as being a respected researcher in immunology in her own right. To my right, we're moving from the grant funders to the industry side of things, and we have Mr. Ken Fitzpatrick. He's the chair of the Oil, Gas and Energy Resources Growth Centre. Ken also has had much experience in industry and as an advisor to government, and he has a degree in chemical engineering. And then on my far right is Peter Schutz. He's the chair of the Food and Agribusiness Growth Centre. Has had a range of executive management roles across business and government. So a very experienced panel with us this afternoon. And I'm going to start because we are looking at what we do well and what we do badly and how we might improve. And I think that there's been a pretty robust articulation of some of the things that we do badly here today. So this panel's going to focus on what we do well and what we could do better, and perhaps try to articulate some solutions. And we're coming at it from a few different perspectives. To start with, I'd like to ask the panellists to speak briefly about their perspective of what we're doing well, what we're doing badly, and how we might improve. And I am going to ask Peter to start, if you don't mind. As sort of you're the old guard of the growth centres, if I may say that, after, 2.5 years?
Yeah, exactly. It's nice to be an old guard after 2.5 years, but I've worked now for 4 ministers and 4 PMs in that period, so that's not very good. And one of the issues that my 2.5 years has shown up is an absolute desire from industry for some continuity. In saying that, I actually should acknowledge Ian McFarlane as the Minister, because he really stuck his neck out to get these growth centres up against a lot of doubters. You might recall the Commission of Audit and the budget, and growth centres, which they weren't called then, but the precincts were mooted to fail, closed down. And Ian McFarlane stuck to it because he believed that government had a role in these 5 areas that are identified as critical for Australia's future, hence the 5 and 2 of us are here. But I have had 2 years, and I came in with lots of ideas of what should happen, because I've been in industry for 44 years and I've been a critic for 44 years. But in saying that I'm a critic, I'm actually an innovator by nature, because I challenge everything and the way it's done, the way it happens, the way the interrelationships occur, and I always try and improve it. And that's what the growth centres are about. So in the last 2 years, we've spent most of the time piloting programs. I think the ghost of Ian was out there somewhere. But so we've been piloting programs that try to illustrate that collaboration is the right thing to do. I use 3 C's in my discussions. I talk about culture, collaboration and capabilities, and skills tacked on the end of it. And innovation overplays the whole lot of those. So the one thing, the driving objective that all of the growth centres have is by June 30th next year to develop a strategy for each sector. So mine is food and agribusiness. I've spent a lot of time, I've engaged with every single RDC, Research and Development Corporation, because they're the agriculture or agribusiness side. So if I'm looking at that, what does that mean? And we've also gone out and mapped using complex adaptive system methodology of what the industries look like. And when you map the food industry and when you map the agriculture industry and you overlay them, they have almost identical influences and negative impacts that apply to them. So food and agribusiness to me is the complete supply chain. And the one learning I've had in the time that I've been there is this lack of understanding by everyone of what the supply chain really means. So when I talk food and agribusiness, I'm talking inputs in that all along the way, which could be genomics, CSIRO's work, universities, at a fundamental breeding or technical inputs at an agricultural level right along the supply chain. So logistics, ports, export markets, innovation and collaboration with universities. So a few of the things we focused on, and give me a bell when I get to 4 minutes because I've got a tendency to go over, is to establish collaborations because we're only 7 people and we can't do all of this ourselves. So what we do when we get feedback from industry, because we're industry driven, is to say who's the best person in Australia to deliver that capability. And that's what we do. So we're now co-located with CSIRO at Werribee and North Ryde. We have offices there. And that's to reinforce CSIRO as the peak industrial research group in the country and its application to food industry as well. So us being with CSIRO just brings that focus. And we have a lot of programs. We have an enterprise solution centre that has been working exceptionally well at Werribee. We have all sorts of data that's available to industry that's up on our web. One thing that I should say is to be a member of our growth centre, all you have to do is ask and you're a member. We don't have joining fees. We want everyone to be a member and you can access our website, our member section, and you can get access to everything. We'll charge for some things going down the track, but there are no membership fees. So collaboration is one thing. We have actually pioneered with Hargraves Institute, who work actually closely with UTS as well. And I saw Roy Green out before, who was involved with Hargraves before. Hargraves came up with an idea around constructive collaboration. So we now have collaborative circles that we use where we bring people around a common problem, technical, industry, and we facilitate the discussions and we help the discussion. And it could be half a day and it's amazing the benefits that come out of that just by people sharing things, acknowledging that there's very new in science and innovation that hasn't been discovered somewhere else before. And it's a matter of adaptation and opening your eyes. So in that case, we've got benefits that industry's identified, $40 million from 5 sessions. So, just simple things like, working with the CRC Association now, so the 5 CRCs that intersect with food and agribusiness, we'll be talking with Tony and the chairs or the chiefs of all of those CRCs to say, how do we get that working more effectively with what we identify as needs within the industry? Training, skills, capability, I could go on forever, but I'll better stop there.
Thank you. Peter, we might come back, I think, to the role of the growth centres and how that intersects with the CRCs a little bit later. But first I'd like to hear from Ken, who, unlike yourself, has had very little time to get ready for that June 2016 deadline to formulate a strategy. You've just finished your consultation, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. And so building on where Peter is after 2.5 years, our growth centre, which is the Energy Resource Growth Centre, oil, gas, coal and uranium, we were approved by Minister Pyne just last week. And so we're now going through the process of establishing the not-for-profit company and then recruiting the staff so that we can then start in 2016 to do some of the things that Peter's been doing for the last couple of years. Again, like Peter, our focus is not only just on improving business research collaboration, but it's also about work skills, it's about supply chain, and very importantly, it's about reducing regulatory burden. And we've got a mission that through a national focus, we can actually improve productivity and sustainability, and also innovation in the oil and gas and energy sectors, because that's how we're going to do it. We need that national focus in order to be able to build the competitiveness and productivity in Australia. So just by way of a simple example, everybody's heard the construction boom in the oil and gas industry is over, and all the employment is tailing off, the investment is tailing off. Well, okay, that's the construction. What's now going to happen is 25 to 35 years of ongoing operations and maintenance. We're going to have 10 LNG plants, 21 trains across Australia, and our challenge is for this industry to be best in class in the world, because if we look at where we are at the moment, it's 30% more expensive to build a plant in Australia than it is to do it in Canada or Mozambique. Now that means that we've got the 21 trains, and we really have to become best in class in ops and maintenance. So when you think about that, that's a very significant challenge for the oil and gas industry. We've all heard about the coal industry and the expansion and the difficulties expanding the coal industry in Australia. And South Australia's got a Royal Commission into the uranium industry. So, you know, there's a number of challenges and barriers in the energy resources industry in Australia which we need to address at a national level. Look, I've just finished the consultation in all of the states. We've probably touched around 200 people. We've got a survey from around 100 people that filled it out. And we've been able to distill our themes into reducing the high cost of development in Australia, CO2 management, water management. Really importantly, looking at the sustainability of the industries in Australia by understanding the social, economic and environmental consequences of development. That's really important when you're thinking about the coal industry or the onshore LNG industry. Looking at how we can unlock the unconventional potential in Australia with shale gas and deep tight oil. And then what's really exciting is using predictive data analytics to improve competitiveness in Australia. Really positive. Great stories, great case studies coming out about how researchers can actually help the industry improve productivity. We heard this morning the gentleman from Rio talking about the rotating machinery and mining by automation. Well, there are all similar stories in the process industries where understanding the process data that comes into the control room, you can improve productivity and competitiveness. But then we talk about how do we actually engage with industry. So when I talk with the researchers, so I talk to our stakeholders, 98% of our stakeholders want to engage better with the researchers and can see the benefit of research in their business. But one of our colleagues, Andrew Stevens, in advanced manufacturing, found exactly the opposite. In the people that he was consulting with, 80% of those companies said they wouldn't go to the universities for applied research. And so that's the real challenge that industry has. How do they actually find out who they should speak to in the research organisations? And we came up with some critical success factors. So coming through the consultation, research needs to be relevant to Australian industry with tangible outcomes. And having industry experienced professors makes it much easier to communicate. Collaboration with industry is really important, whether it's one company, 3 companies or many companies. And a common sense approach to IP, really important, because you don't want the IP discussion to get ahead of the research, because you don't actually know you've got any IP until you do the research. So look, in conclusion, I think that research needs to deliver tangible outcomes to industry. Industry needs to collaborate better with the researchers, and the large companies do that really well. But there's a real opportunity for the mid-tier companies and the small, medium enterprises to be able to connect with the researchers. There are two barriers that we found with the dialogue, and they're on the industry side. First of all, industry quite often doesn't know what their research priorities are, or they can't articulate them. And then secondly, if they do know what their research priorities are, they don't always want to share that with competitors in the room. So the ongoing engagement between the researchers and industry has to be multifaceted. It needs to be in collaborative forums, but it also has to be on one-on-one outreach programs, so you can actually touch those companies that you might think will be able to help you fund a particular research program, or even an SME that can help commercialise. And then the last thing that came out is that quite often there's a gap in the communication and the understanding between the researcher and the industry, because they don't actually speak the same language, and industry quite often doesn't understand how the research is going to be applied. So this came up in the panel session this morning, that communication in industry speak is really important.
Thank you. And I think, I understand, Anne, that that's something that you would like to talk about as well. Now, we're going from a very young and new organisation, which I suppose has the benefit, while being young, of being able to choose your own adventure to some extent, to a very well-established organisation where you might have some challenges in terms of adapting and changing the way that things are done. Would you like to speak about that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kylie. I've been CEO of the NHMRC for just 6 months, but as Kylie said, NHMRC's been around for a very long time, most of the last century. And so it's been funding medical research on behalf of the federal government for many, many years. So I'd just like to say a couple of things about NHMRC and then about 2 or 3 issues that I think are worth raising. So first of all, we fund the full spectrum of public sector medical research in this country. So that goes from discovery research, biomedical discovery research, through clinical science, public health research, and health services research. So that full spectrum from the laboratory through to the community. And we spend something like $850 million a year, so it's much the same as the ARC budget, on funding people, on funding projects of various sizes, and funding centres. Most of that spending is in the university sector, some of it's in the independent medical research institutes, a little bit of it is in the hospitals, and a tiny amount elsewhere. So a broad spectrum of research, but very much university and medical research institute focused. So our goal is, in fact, not to support business and not to make money, it is to improve human health. And so that has to be the overarching goal of everything we do. And so it's critically important for us that we see translation of the research that's funded by NHMRC through into better health. And that might be better clinical care in hospitals or in primary health care, or it might be better public health policy. And if you're talking about that kind of translation, for the most part, it doesn't go via business in any conventional sense. Of course, it goes via the big business of hospitals and private health insurance and all sorts of those sorts of business, but not the type of business that I think we're talking about here today. But if you have research that's producing a new medical device, like a cochlear implant, if you're talking about research to produce a new drug or a new vaccine, then of course in the health area, that means you absolutely can't go anywhere without massive commercial investment. And that's of course because anything that's going to end up in a human or administered to a human has to go through very substantial safety testing and then a series of clinical trials to determine the efficacy of that new device or new treatment. And so no university or institute or hospital in Australia could possibly imagine undertaking that full pathway of research and development without commercial partnership. So that's a really critical issue in the health and medical research area. So most of the funding that we administer from NHMRC is in response to submissions from investigators, and it's mostly to do the research rather than to commercialise it. But we do have one funding scheme called development grants that are a bit like the ARC linkage grants, It's a small scheme, it'd be less than 5% of our total budget, but it's one that's focused on helping researchers go at least one step beyond where they already are to become commercially attractive with their research. And so to get the proof of principle data that might be necessary to get commercial investment. And ideally these grants are put in with a commercial partner. And importantly, in assessing those grants, we're using industry experts as well as academic scientific experts to assess the validity and the strength, scientific and commercial, of the project. So that seems to be a pretty successful program. When it was reviewed 2 or 3 years ago, it turned out that of 40 projects reviewed, more than half of them had in fact succeeded in going down the commercial pathway, and several of them had already got to the stage of product or of seeking regulatory approval for a product. So that's pretty good, but it's also clear that it's really tiny. And so with plateau funding at the moment for NHMRC, there's very limited capacity to expand that type of program. But it is successful and we'd love to be able to do more of it. Now, one of the issues that emerges from that sort of program and our wider thinking about the NHMRC's funding schemes is the difficulty we have, it's an issue that came up this morning, in recognising and rewarding commercialisation and industry experience. And so whether people are applying for a regular grant or fellowship or whether they're applying for a development grant, which is more commercially focused, we don't have a long history of knowing how to take into account those particular strengths around understanding intellectual property, pitching ideas, as was discussed this morning, understanding the path to commercialisation, how you design a proof of principle experiment, which might be different from the type of experiments you want to do to get published in Nature or Cell or the New England Journal of Medicine. And we don't know how really fully to deal with the time that some people might spend working in industry where they don't have conventional academic outputs of scientific papers. So that's something that NHMRC has been working on for a while now to try to improve that assessment of track records so that we really encourage and foster and bring into the medical research fold people who have this type of experience and help them to get funded. It seems to me that one of the issues there in bringing that into practice is the third issue I wanted to bring up, and the one that Kylie has mentioned, and that is commercial literacy. So if we think about most of the people who are reviewing grant applications to the NHMRC, and in fact submitting grant applications to the NHMRC, very few do in fact have a lot of experience with the development and commercialisation of intellectual property or of engaging with the commercial sector at all. And so I think that makes it even more difficult for those people to assess others' track records and take that into account. We don't have very well established metrics. Of course, we can count patents, but then people have to have a reasonably deep understanding of the patent prosecution cycle to know how to assess a patent record. And we lack people who have that kind of experience and the experience of setting up a spin-off company or engaging with large pharma. So I think that an area that's very obvious to me, perhaps coming for part of my time as a CRC director, is that relatively low commercial literacy amongst academic researchers, amongst those who come to NHMRC. And that's one area where I think as a sector we could do very much better. I think NHMRC can try to engage with the universities about how we can collectively foster the development of commercial literacy. We have, just as a final comment, we have a new committee starting very shortly to advise the NHMRC, and that's the Health Innovation Advisory Committee, so a timely title for the new committee. And it's chaired by Graham Samuel and has a very interesting range of people with deep industry experience as well as health and medical research experience. I think they're going to be very useful advisors to us in seeing how at NHMRC we can take the next step in this area. So thank you.
Thank you. Aidan, from one massive research funder to another.
Yes, indeed.
You've had some experience, obviously, in looking at metrics, obviously, and I would wager some thoughts on some of Anne's comments. Would you like to give us your take?
Carry on, I think. That's probably the story. I mean, a lot of what Anne said is absolutely relevant to the ARC. The ARC administers slightly under $800 million these days, and covering all disciplines. So we don't just fund the medical domain in the broad, we fund everything in the broad, and that's a critical element of what the ARC does, and indeed a portfolio of things. We've got to support basic research and applied research. It is worth emphasising, the theme of the discussion is what we do well. I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much. We actually have a very, very high-class research system in Australia, supported over many years through the ARC and the NHMRC. And Australian researchers are, world recognised in their field. So we have actually created some good things here, and I think we do have to think about that in the balance of how we make it better. A lot of the issues that Anne mentioned, evaluating track records for people that have crossed that bridge between academia and industry, we grapple with too. These are our relative opportunity performance evaluation frameworks that we've been introducing to the ARC. It's a struggle for us too to get the right people on our evaluation panels, for instance. It's very easy for us to get people from universities because we are a funder of universities. So universities see it as an important thing to participate in our processes. Much, much harder to get engagement with people in industry who don't see that direct benefit there. But again, let's not beat ourselves up too much. We have been doing some very, very good things over many, many years. I was quite struck last week. We had the Prime Minister's Science Prizes, and we had the inaugural prize for innovation won by Graham Jameson from the University of Newcastle for his work in minerals, separation of minerals through flotation processes. And of course, Graham has been supported by the ARC over decades through our discovery program, which normally is about basic research, but of course what he's doing is very, very applied and relevant. And also, of course, through our linkage programs, which is about building partnerships outside academia. So we do have very important programs in place, and I think it's really important, and we've heard a lot today about continuity and how important that is. To tinker with them, yes, but to leave the basic frameworks in place. And so we're very much in the ARC about improving and trying to change things, and we're very, very open to initiatives that can improve the translation of the very high quality research that comes out of our universities to helping with developing innovation within Australia. It's very interesting, this morning Tony Peacock pointed to me a report that came out of not the Office of the Chief Scientist, but the Office of the Chief Economist out of the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science. And that's a very interesting report that's looking at innovation entrepreneurship in this country. And two of the entities that are actually quite important for the creation of innovation and innovative companies have actually been the centres of excellence. And as I say, it's concentrated. Innovative activity is concentrated around investment in what we might have ordinarily thought as investment in basic research. So the two do go together in a very direct way. The ARC schemes, as I mentioned, we are open to changing and innovating. We are looking at better ways to make our linkage program more effective. And we have a dedicated scheme that I'm actually quite proud of, and I've been talking with the growth centres too, of how to much more directly align the activity in the growth centres to work that we fund, recognising that it is a partnership. It is about us helping the universities to engage, and we're hoping to work much, much closer together with the growth centres to get the industry side engaging as much as possible.
Thank you. I would like to open it up to questions. I might kick it off by remarking that those of us in the science sector come to a lot of events such as this one where we hear over and over again that science needs to collaborate better with industry. I'd like to know whether industry hears the same message about science. Peter, would you care to make some observations on that?
Yeah, industry does hear exactly the same thing. So it's a generic problem across the whole field. One of the things in the growth centres is that we also have money. There's a growth centre fund, and over the next 4 years we get approximately $15 million each to invest in industry projects driven by industry. And a lot of the discussions we've had with Aidan around how do you have industry actually identifying needs and driving those activities more. At the moment it's a bit hit and miss. You know, you don't know who to go to. Someone talked about the language. We don't speak the same language. The way that the growth centres will work by having money to spend on specific projects, which will be then matched 50% or 100%, so it's 50-50 in the project, by companies putting money in, will change the landscape quite significantly. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've attracted money on the basis of the Enterprise Solutions Centre I talked about at Werribee, where we've had 24 projects. We now have money that's going in there. CSIRO's put money in, South Australian Government, Victorian Government, Queensland Government have put money in, and industry will match it. So we now have almost $4 million being invested by industry and government across the field that would never have happened before, just on the basis of establishing collaborations and understanding how they can work.
As Ken mentioned, though, the notion of collaboration, it perhaps isn't as familiar to those in the commercial world as it is to those in the scientific research world. How do we get around that cultural mismatch?
So, I'm sorry if I'm going to dominate it, but in a project that we will do, an industry need, we will insist that the project engages with at least one large company and several small companies, so we won't fund it for one company. We're going to force collaboration around an industry issue so that companies will have to collaborate. We will say, once we do some research as to who's the best researcher, 2 universities minimum will have to have a contribution to it. So we'll force the collaboration by having the money tied to an essential collaboration process. And as I mentioned before, the Collaborative Circles program, where you have structured collaboration, start to show that you can in fact make it work very successfully. It doesn't happen by osmosis and it doesn't happen naturally. It has to be forced somehow initially, and as we go on with these programs, it will become much more the norm. So in discussions with Aidan, definitely through the ITRP program, we're talking about that these must be industry problems that, and that it must fit into the strategies that the 5 of us develop for the sectors. So those strategies will drive what the CRCs do, what ITRP, what CSIRO's focus will be, what government programs will be. That's a very significant change to the way things have happened in the past.
And is that how it works in health and medical research? Are you forcing collaboration?
We strongly encourage and reward collaboration. And money speaks, doesn't it? Actually, one of the really interesting programs we have is the partnership projects and occasionally partnership centres. And these are centres or projects built around problems in health. So it might not be a business problem, but they will be a health industry problem or a health care problem that then is picked up by researchers who are part of that discussion and then apply for funding to support it. So I think that's one of the ways that we strongly promote across what might otherwise be a significant divide type of collaboration. Of course, in medical research, people are incredibly collaborative, but they're not necessarily thinking about collaborating with industry. They're more likely to be thinking about collaborating with someone elsewhere in another country. I mean, a lot of US collaborators are on our project grant applications, a lot of collaborators around the world.
And how do you deal with that when you're talking about scientists who, as you say, are accustomed to collaborating across institutes and across disciplines and across nations? When you are dealing with a business or a commercial enterprise, which has to be by its very nature competitive, is it a retraining exercise then to get the scientists to sort of think in that space of competition rather than collaboration?
Yeah, and we certainly had that experience in the CRC for vaccine technology that I was in for 13 years and was director of for the last 6 years of it, 2000 to 2006. And so we had a lot of researchers who probably came in pretty much as Ian Fraser said this morning, thinking this is another source of money. But they were there for long enough and exposed for long enough to the thinking of industry that many of them really started to get it. But they had to, through that process, understand that once they were in a collaborative arrangement with a particular company, then that did put some constraints on them. And of course, that is one of the challenges for us as medical researchers of how we handle the constraints of secret information, secret research that can't be talked about as soon as it's been done, can't be talked about at the conference next week without approval. It is a whole different mindset. So I think the CRCs have been a really important place for many academic scientists to learn these basic rules of commercial engagement. And some will walk away and think, well, that's not for me, that's not how I want to operate. But others absolutely get it and get excited about seeing that as a way that they can see their research lead to something tangible that might ultimately produce a device or a drug or a vaccine or help people in some way. So our experience in the CRC for vaccine technology was that engagement was very, very positive for a number of people. And I did mean to say, and didn't in talking about commercial literacy, if I can say it now, I think that one of the big advantages of that CRC exposure and of getting commercial literacy more broadly across the research sector is that people will start to realise that there are job opportunities for them there. So we have a problem at the moment. We have vast numbers of postdocs who are having trouble getting jobs. There are not enough fellowships for people as they move up through the funding schemes. We do want people to know that there's a whole world of other ways that their scientific education and brilliance and inspiration can be put to good use and give them rewarding careers. So a spin-off of improved commercial literacy in our research institutions would, I think, be a wider appreciation of the opportunities in the commercial sector for gainful and rewarding employment.
Ken, while we're improving the commercial literacy of scientists, are you improving the scientific literacy of business folk on the other side? And by that, I'm not talking necessarily about learning to think like scientists or to learn science trivia, but to think about the way that science might approach in that more collaborative manner, which I suspect there's a bit of an allergy to.
Look, that's right, and I'd like to build a little bit on what Peter was saying, that there are pockets of excellence out there, and there are, for example, the Excellent Plus programs at the University of Queensland and the coal seam gas, the Centre for Coal Seam Gas in Queensland, where you actually have companies coming together with a research organisation to do something to have a very focused outcome. And similarly, in Western Australia, there's the Premier's Roundtable for Marine Science, where amazingly you've got pearlers, fishermen, recreational fishermen, and the oil and gas industry all sitting around the table talking about how they can have a 20-year vision for environmental research in Western Australia. I think that's fantastic. So there is those mechanisms in place to get the business community to understand the need for the science, and for the science community to understand there's got to be a commercial outcome here. And those two are just two simple examples of how it comes together.
Has anybody got any questions for the panel? Yes, up there in the middle. I think there's a microphone coming to you now.
We have incredibly long timelines to the two major research funders to get industry funding out, and they tend not to fit well with industry. Comes to me with a question, they want to actually invest some time in it, but they don't necessarily want to wait a year to get the funding, and then another year by the time we actually sign the agreements and go through all the processes. Everybody's lost interest or the time's moved on. I was wondering if you could comment on ways that maybe we could address that.
Your comment there has been one that we've heard a lot, and one way to fix that is to take a program like Linkage and run it in a much more continuous mode, much more responsive, so you don't have the 9 months in between the application close and the decision point. So it's on our agenda, and I hope I can do it soon.
And if I could just add to that too, that's definitely a comment that comes back from industry and the researchers that we talk to. Why bother? And I think that's really encouraging to do that on that continuous basis, because the other thing the growth centres can do is actually outline what our research priorities are, and I highlighted 4 of ours, so that the research community understands that if you want to do something with the oil and gas growth centre, you need to be thinking about predictive analytics, for example, And so there's already a framework there for Aidan's group to say, this fits the box, let's move it forward. So we've definitely heard that message.
Aidan, sorry, go ahead.
We're having the same conversation at NHMRC and already run 3 rounds a year for partnership projects, for example, which has been a very good test run of how you establish a budget which you then don't know how you're going to spend through the year. So it has a number of interesting challenges, but we are having that discussion about our development grants for specifically the reason you raised.
I'm just wondering, my kids collect the ancient animals cards, whether there are ministers' cards that you collect to go. Hot off the press. We have a question here from the gentleman in the 3rd row.
Labour market issues are very important and something we take seriously in CSIRO, but welcome any comments.
There's a lot of criticism about the quality, or not the quality, it's about the industry readiness of people coming out of universities, etc. But the more you get involved in it as well, I've identified that one of the biggest problems is, in fact, industry doesn't support mentoring, scholarships, placements of postdocs for a year while they're doing their postdoc. They just don't do it. They're critical, but they don't do it. So one of the programs that we're implementing is to try and incorporate that industry readiness when they get out. So to me, it's all about providing an opportunity and a career path, because that's what's missing in a lot of these areas. I'm not sure I'm actually answering your question directly, but industry have been critical, but they've not actually done anything about it constructively either. So we're trying to work from that side as well. I know in the ITRP program, this current round, I think it's in December, there's a compulsory requirement that the postdoc must spend 12 months in industry and that they must have a mentor. I mean, that's really starting to put the onus on industry to put back into it as well, and not just criticise on the other side.
And if I could just add to that, I think Peter's exactly right, that industry has to play its part, and it's quite a telling statistic that 60% of our PhDs are actually working in research organisations or government institutions, as opposed to the other way around, having that PhD experience in industry. So I think the pendulum has to swing. In the energy industry, it's going to take some time because of the commodity prices, and there's a real ceiling on employment growth. But over time, I think you'll see that coming because of the things that Aidan's putting in place, that you have to have a mentor and a PhD experienced in the industry. So that will build that employment engagement over a period of 5 to 10 years.
I wonder whether one of the issues, and Jackie, I'll come to you in a minute, whether one of the issues is that there is a public good, an inherent public good imperative in government-funded research, whereas industry, it could be argued, has no such imperative.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, we certainly don't approach it that way. So we're saying because the minister or the government have identified 5 key areas of the economy that need investing in, hence the 5 growth centres, that will do our public good by increasing their capability to grow new markets, have new products, interface with the free trade agreements, get products out there and grow the economy. If we can double our production and our markets at a premium price, which is what's behind what we do, we're doing our public good that way, and I think the rest follows. I'm not going in there as a missionary trying to do all these nice things.
No, well, there obviously has to be a benefit to the industry, doesn't there?
Yeah.
Coming back to the question, I think it does in part answer your question, because it is about trying to grow the diversity of opportunities for young researchers, and not just say to them the only game in town is a research career. And initiatives like our ITRP, indeed like the ones that Jeff Prince is championing, internships of PhDs in industry, I think are really important for this country. It was interesting, I was in Taiwan a number of months ago, and I visited ITRI, which is the CSIRO equivalent, very strongly connected into the industry side of things, but they take PhD students from universities, and in fact my view is that their universities are less connected to industry than ours are. And then ITRI trains them up, and I asked the question, well, how long does it take them to get ready so they're useful for industry? And they said 5 years. And that's a long time. So I'm very much a champion in wanting to seeing our PhD students have a much stronger engagement with industry and other parts of the innovation sector to create the jobs. But let's not make the mistake of trying to shoehorn it into 3 years. Let's recognise that it is going to take longer, that there are a whole different sets of skills that we want our very good young researchers to learn, as well as the research side of things, and then build that into the research experience as well.
Should there be some sort of sorting at that level? I mean, not everybody is going to be suitable for a brilliant research career, but not everybody is going to be suitable for working in industry or becoming a science administrator or any of the other range of possible careers.
Indeed, and coming back to the model that you talked about, the US have talked about a sorting mechanism that I don't approve of at all. And
it's
that's
like the Harry Potter sorting hat.
Yes, sort of. But it's a fiscal one to say, well, we're training too many PhD students, so why don't you use a mechanism of making the PhD student stipend much greater to actually limit the amount of money for the number of students there and choke back demand in that sense. Now, that's a pretty ugly scenario, but that's the sort of things that are getting bounced around as well. I would rather not do that. I would say diversify the experience of the PhD students, get them to think about other options and solve the problem that way.
At a time when we universally agree that there needs to be more collaboration and more innovation, I'm not sure whether we universally agree on how we're going to measure it. And I guess there's different camps. We've heard a lot of people speaking this morning that there are academic ways of measuring it and commercial ways of measuring it. It's probably got to be both. So I'm interested in the panel's view about how Australia should be measuring the breadth of our collaboration, but more importantly, the impact of it.
Thank you. It's quite a challenging question because, of course, it's easy to measure academic collaboration simply by co-publications and co-getting of grants, but that's not measuring the true output in the sense that you mean, and very much harder anyway to measure the true outcomes of research. So that's a challenge for NHMRC and I imagine for ARC across the board, as it is for all research institutions. How do we best demonstrate that we're actually spending money well, and that the final outcome of that has given us a good return on investment? And it was brought up this morning how difficult it is to measure return on investment because you can't do it project by project. That would be crazy, and you'd need to look back probably with a 50-year hindsight. So I think we're all struggling with that. In medical research, ultimately, as I've already said, our goal is improved human health, and so our most important parameters are around evidence of having an impact on policy or clinical practice, or picking up of a new idea for commercial development so that it will ultimately end up being hopefully useful for human health. So that's a measure of collaboration, but it's very much a focus on the end game. What's the actual impact on health?
So if I can make a comment, being the owner of an evaluation process of research in universities, which is the ERA process, the ERA measures a very specific thing, which is the quality of research. And it is my view, and actually remains my view, that if you want a single indicator, then picking on quality is the best thing you could possibly pick. And it's very interesting because ATSI did a very good exercise at the beginning of this year looking at engagement metrics, which is with industry, so commercialisation dollars, and if you normalise it, it can tell a quite important story, but it's extraordinarily strongly correlated with quality anyway. Now, that's not to say that we should be complacent and stop there, though, because we've driven universities to think and focus about quality. We have to try and do something really quite interesting. We've got to try and measure the impact of research, which is actually almost unmeasurable. Nobody has measured the impact of research because of the long timelines, the multiple contributions and all sorts of confounding factors. But we do have to try and acknowledge where institutions are doing a better job or a worse job at engagement and connection. And that is something really important to do, but we've got to do it very carefully, because if you pick on the wrong indicators, you will drive universities in the wrong direction. So I think the challenge of a nation is, can we put together a suite of indicators that can tell a story about how particular institutions are effectively engaging, and tell it in such a way that it provides a positive driver so that the system can improve. And I think that's the next objective. Thanks.
Just make it quick.
Please.
To us in the growth centres, there are two parts of innovation. One is the fundamental blue sky innovation I think you're talking about. To us in the industry, and what I fund is short term. And I say short term, it could be 3 months, it could be 12 months, and you can easily measure that. So in the SME Solutions Centre at Werribee and Cooper's Plains in Brisbane, we had 24 projects, 16 of them were successful, and the value ascribed by the participants through new sales was $34 million. That's easy. Now what you've got to do is say, why'd the 6 fail? And we'll look at that. But in those sort of areas where a problem that industry has, a technical problem, is preventing them from getting into the market, we provide the connection to the research provider or the technical solutions, and we fund it. And we can easily measure that. And on the basis of that success, we're now, that's what I was talking about before, taking that up to $4 million this year and potentially much higher, and some of the other funds from government going into it. We can measure that, and we can force collaboration. So in collaboration, you know, the paper today in The Australian said we're number 29 out of 30 on the OECD in collaboration. I'd like to know how you measure that. But we're also, in terms of commercialising technology, we're last, we're 30th. And again, I'd like to know how we measure it, but the fact that there are measurements there and we're so low and so bad means we've got a big problem. And it's not just universities, it's the discussion we've been having with industry both ways.
We have one more question. Who has the microphone at the back there?
Deborah Roberts from the UTS Business School. I just wanted to make a comment actually that universities are thinking around this space in terms of their doctorate programs. And so, for example, UTS has just introduced its industry doctorate program, and this is where there is an opportunity for industry to engage PhD candidates and along the spectrum. So industry can either own the whole IP, or the university or the student can own the whole IP. And it's a continuum along there and a negotiated agreement. And it's also one in which the candidate can work within industry, so they gain work-ready skills as well. So there's a big win-win. And I know that a lot of universities around Australia are heading down this path, and I think that given all the things that you've been saying down there, I think there are greater opportunities to take advantage of these new programs.
I'm going to put you all on the spot now and do one thing to improve the situation. What would that one thing be, Aidan?
I'd put more money into things like our centres of excellence.
You're making friends here today. Anne?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think I naturally want to say more money, but it's the targeting of that money that's really critical for this particular area. So I do think that the education of people in universities to think more broadly about their science would be a big step forward, not to only think along the academic path.
Ken?
Look, I think large companies do the R&D thing quite well. And, you know, you hear the names like, you know, BHP, Woodside, Chevron, Shell. For my point, I think it's the mid-tier companies that we've got to attract. And so my focus is trying to get the SMEs and the mid-tier companies in our extractive industries to be more aware of the industry opportunity. So to me, it's actually getting the mid-tier companies into the same program and the way of thinking.
And Peter?
Yeah, well, in the food and agribusiness industry, the last remaining Australian food multinational, if you like, disappeared a little while ago in Goodman Fielder. So it's dominated by multinationals and they don't spend money on research in Australia. So if I had a magic wand, I would be trying to build up, and it's my objective, small companies into mediums, mediums into big. But I also want to pick up on what Ken said right early, is the availability of timely data that people can make real-time decisions that impact their future is an absolute need for it. And e-commerce with the free trade agreements, we've just got to build capabilities. So I would like to see a much greater focus in those last two areas across industry and institutions.
Peter, Ken and Aidan, thank you all very much for your precious time and excellent expertise today. I'm sure that everyone will be very happy to interrogate you during the break.